I'm going to go ahead and do my little short introduction.
Okay.
It will take about a minute, so it will give a few more people time to get in. I want to say that I'm delighted again that so many people from psychology has been participating this year, because psychology is one of those disciplines that is uniquely positioned between science and the humanities, and it shows how the two are interrelated. I think psychology has, to me, been one of the most important disciplines that the Humanities Center can serve. So I'm delighted that so many people participated. Dr. Partridge is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology here at Wayne and director of the Research, Design, and Analysis Unit. His research includes the influence of urban poverty on early childhood development, adolescent risk behaviors, developmental psychobiology, emotion regulation, uh, early childhood literacy, and relational development systems theory. He has had over 20 years of community-based research, public health and prevention interventions, and evaluation research. Recent evaluations include a multi-site evaluation of the impact of school-based health centers on adolescent health and mental health, 2 federal social innovation fund award projects evaluating interventions designed to promote positive outcomes for at-risk children from birth to 5 years old and their families, and a process evaluation of a multi-service, multi-agency intervention through Head Start and Early Head Start. He has published over 80 book chapters, articles, and technical reports, including editing a special issue on genetics and human behavior. He has served on the editorial boards of Developmental Psychology, Early Education and Development, and Research and Human Development. These are all prestigious journals. Today, he will give a presentation on an important topic, social justice agenda, a social justice agenda for developmental science. So I am delighted to welcome to the virtual podium, Professor Ty Partridge.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And I appreciate everybody taking the time. Can everybody see that all right?
I do.
Yes.
Okay, cool. To taking the time to come and listen to this. I apologize for the 45 minutes or so that you're not going to be able to get back in your life, but hopefully it'll be reasonably well spent. So this is a talk that's a little bit different. I'm going to talk about a couple of research examples, but really more of a way of integrating a social science or a social justice orientation into developmental science, and mostly just to kind of keep myself on track and get this kind of overall roadmap of where we're going. First, I want to talk a little bit about social justice and what we mean by social justice. That's one of those notoriously slippery concepts that we all kind of feel like we know what it means, but it's hard to pin down. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm thinking about it. And then a little bit about developmental science, kind of defining what I mean by developmental science, but also it's, I think, relatively unique ability to interlace concepts of social justice alongside it. So it's a way of sort of linking social justice principles to a scientific methodology and theory. And then specifically pointing to a couple of concepts in developmental science that provide a good venue for framing social justice challenges. And then another aspect of this that I think goes beyond just developmental science, but is really talking about values-based social science, And I'll get more into that when I get to that point. And then a very early start at kind of applying this kind of approach to community-based research. So first, social justice over the last several years has been a topic that has really risen to the forefront of the national conversation. It's something that has existed in America since 1619. Obviously, there's been social injustices throughout our entire history, but it really has risen to the top of the national conversation recently, with everything from, issues of police brutality, the southern border policy, if you want to call it a policy, the way that post 9/11 policies and initiatives affected the Muslim community, the recent cases that we see in Georgia and Texas and other places of trying to restrict political enfranchisement and ability to vote. Also the recent political scapegoating of the AAPI community, as well as these larger structural inequities that are embedded in neighborhood determinants of health and well-being, a lot of structural racism in terms of geographic location and neighborhood, the overlaying presence of white supremacy and androcentrism as risk factors. And I'm saying this very specifically in that we often talk about, race as a risk factor, socioeconomic status as a risk factor, but it's not race that's a risk factor, it's racism that's a risk factor. There's nothing inherent about race or gender or ethnicity that is a risk factor. It's the way that it's interlaced with this kind of white supremacy framework. And I also want to highlight the fact that when we talk about white supremacy and androcentrism, which is basically male-centric worldviews, it's not, with the image that comes to mind, and I think, and I don't want to speak for all white people, but the image that immediately comes to mind are things like the KKK and the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, or whatever these white supremacist, white nationalist organizations are. But it's really much more pervasive than that, and really thinking about white supremacy and androcentrism as the cultural default norm. The default norm is a white male in American society, and the value systems and the way that society is structured. So thinking about social justice in those terms, as well as the broader implications of colonialism and the relationship between the global North and the global South in terms of economic disparities and systems of social and economic oppression that exist globally with that. So that's kind of the broad framework of where this comes into play. And when we talk about social justice, again, that's sort of one of those terms that it feels, we all kind of know what we mean, but then it's really hard to empirically pin down. And I kind of follow a framework from Nancy Fraser. I've listed a reference to her 2009 book on social justice, which has been a big formative text for me. And she outlines basically three different types or aspects of social justice or injustice. And one is, redistributive social justice, where it's really about the equitable distribution of resources, particularly things like generational wealth and income. And the redistributive social justice movement is really probably the oldest, at least in terms of Western Europe and the United States, with the workers' movements of the early 20th century. But alongside that is also a component of recognition justice and having a cultural recognition and visibility. And I immediately think of Ralph Ellison's work in Invisible Man, where there are marginalized communities that just become invisible to the larger social discussion and discourse. And it's about, seeing representation of the heterogeneity of our culture in social media, mass media, and, kind of the presentation of the culture. And then finally, representational justice, where there's a socio-political representation of different groups. And we've seen really good strides with this recently. We're not anywhere where we need to be, but looking at the importance of, someone like Kamala Harris as a vice president, Deb Haaland as the first Indigenous American to hold a cabinet position, and notably Department of Interior. So those kinds of social representative or social political representations are really important. And I think cumulatively, all of this leads to a fundamental component of social justice, which is the ability of an individual or a member of a group to, I'm gonna have to minimize my thing so I can actually see what I'm doing, to have an autonomy of decision-making and socio-political empowerment. And that's really the ultimate goal of social justice, I think, cumulatively. Others may disagree with that, but so in thinking about, that's kind of the social justice framework, but then linking that to developmental science. I'm a psychologist by training, a developmental community psychologist. And we often think about developmental psychology, but there's been a big change over the last 2 decades. Well, I'm aging myself now, probably 3 decades, if not more, to moving towards developmental science and recognizing that this area of study really focuses on understanding the process of continuity and change, both in the individual and their shifting context at multiple levels of influence, from molecular biology and genetics all the way up to socio-historical factors. So it is inherently an interdisciplinary area of study, and nothing that we do in any of our individual areas of study can really fully make sense without the integration of these other areas of influence. So developmental psychology is a little bit more misleading because this is such an inherently interdisciplinary science. And the model on the right here, this is, I would argue, probably the most pervasive theoretical model that we use in developmental science. And it's built on Bronfenbrenner's work on a nested ecology. And basically at the center, because we're humans and we put humans at the center of everything, we have the developing child, and that's just kind of the focus of traditional developmental psychology, looking at the attributes of the child. And then the child is embedded in this microsystem or set of local environments like the home, the school, their neighborhood, their peer group, things that they have direct proximal contact with. But those microsystems are also connected to each other. I always use the example of things like school and parent-teacher conferences and work-home influences, where you have these different micro contexts, but they all are interconnected to each other through individual members of the family unit, and that those mesosystems are embedded in a larger ecosystem and macro system that look at societal level influences and structures. And then finally, from a developmental perspective, these are all embedded in a chronosystem. These all change over time. And I think what's unique about developmental science, and there's several areas of this model that we identify, but we don't always do, particularly in psychology, a great job of including, is that the chronosystem is not just the individual's time span, not just the individual's developmental trajectory over time, but also the social ecology and how it's changing over time. So you've got multiple levels of influence changing at different time scales, but they're intersecting each other. And that's really where the power of developmental science, this developmental science framework, really comes through. In applying that to issues of social justice, we can take a look at the ecological model of development, but then view it from different lenses of marginalization and one of the graduate students in our program, one of our PhD students, Lama Ayub, who works in my lab, has done some really tremendous work on developing a racialized ecological model that really applies critical race theory to Bronfenbrenner's original model, and thinking about how this ecology diversifies depending on group membership. And you can also overlay institutional and individual sources of oppression and overlay them into this ecology to really understand how elements of oppression are acting on an individual as they're developing at multiple levels of influence. So everything from, like, you know, the defined norm, and this is where I was kind of getting into that early definition of like white supremacy and androcentrism, where the default human in American culture is a white, cisgendered, middle class, largely Christian male, right? And so that's kind of the default human, and everything else is in reference to that or gets othered in terms of that. In a discussion recently with some developmental colleagues, highlighting the issue that, you know, we'll see articles in developmental journals about, you know, African-American children and academic achievement, or Asian American children and acculturation, but you never see any article titled white American children X. And so it's just kind of an indicator of the subtle way that that becomes the default position. But we can also look at these other ecological influences at an institutional level and socioeconomic level, in the way that it disenfranchises marginalized groups, as well as how it happens at the individual level through things like physical aggression and intimidation and harassment and those sorts of things. Another aspect of developmental science and developmental systems theory that's kind of the core model is this life course theory notion that Glenn Elder is most well known for. And this is really tapping into that chronosystem and making it explicit, but not only looking at that chronosystem in terms of the individual, but also of how societies change, and that different cohorts of individuals grow up in the context of different ecological systems, but they're not independent of each other. And so on the left here, you see an example from some of Elder's work, looking at how different generational cohorts intersected societal level shifts and changes in China through the 20th century, and how they, not only do you develop in different contexts in terms of what, you know, societal influences are placing on you, but where you intersect those changes has a difference. I have a friend who grew up in China and had never heard of Tiananmen Square until she moved to Canada. Her parents, Tiananmen Square was a big formative part of their life, but the way that the cultural shifts happened, that uprising didn't really have an impact on her development sense of identity in the way that it did her parents, who were students at the time. So it's important to kind of look at those things. And then again, it's another opportunity to take this generalized framework about looking at the intersection of ecological, historical change and individual change, and look at it through a marginalized population lens. And pull this example from Diakwe. I'm just gonna, that's my best stab at how you pronounce that name. It did a really fantastic paper integrating this life course perspective with critical race theory and understanding how these historical epochs and the generational co-influence influences individual development. And it plays out for example, in the work of one of my colleagues, Rhiannon Anderson, and her presentations on Black parents giving the talk to their children, or the way that mothers talk to their daughters based on intergenerational experiences. So it just gives you another way to kind of frame how these mechanisms of social injustice get intersected into an individual's developmental course. The other thing that I would like to point out here is that one of the challenges with the way developmental systems theory is currently framed in the Bronfenbrenner model is that it's portrayed as these, concentric circles, and they're nested in terms of a hierarchy. And so we have a tendency to think of them as separate spheres of influence. And I'll put on my statistician hat for a second and say, we tend to think of them as independent, isolated, unique sources of variance. So here's the influence of parents, here's the influence of peers, here's the influence of neighborhood structure, and they're kind of all additively and independently adding to shape an individual's development. But in reality, it's probably better to think of this nested ecology, and particularly the social, historical, cultural context, as a medium of development. It's something that we develop from and in, and I use this Escher drawing as an example, where each of these spheres of influence do have unique attributes in the way that they work and the kind of variables that you would pull out of them. But we experience them in development holistically, and it's really hard to tell where one begins and one ends. And in econometrics, they refer to this as the endogeneity problem, where separating things into independent and dependent variables is kind of a huge challenge because they're co-influencing each other. And one of the implications for this in terms of social justice is that you have these institutional and social structures that are the mechanisms through which sources of oppression occur and are implemented. And that exists sort of outside the individual, but the individual is immersed in this social context in a way that begins to internalize and shape their own sense of identity. And so you have systems of oppression working both external to the individual and then internally to the individual in a kind of compounding way, in the way that we shape a sense of identity and belonging that I think is important to recognize. And I have to use my mouse. So how do we take this interlacing set of conceptual frameworks and move forward? Well, there's some tools that we can pull out of developmental science that give us some ways of thinking about intervening in issues around social injustice. I put in here in the subtitle to, we talk about science and using science. Please don't forget the humanities. I'm a huge believer in the power of narrative. And my son is an English history double major, and most of the time it turns out that we're doing exactly the same thing, just from different points of view in how we're trying to understand social influences on individuals. So I think it is a collective effort in that way, even though I'm framing it in terms of science. So some ways of thinking about conducting science that come out of developmental systems theory and developmental science that are useful for addressing social justice-oriented concerns is really this shift that we've seen in the way that we conceptualize the conduction of science in developmental science, in particular related to psychology. Although we're not as far along in this path as I would like, it's certainly been heading this direction for a couple of decades, where we're moving really from variable-centered research. And this is, traditional statistical analysis where we isolate the effects of a dependent variable and an independent variable, And we're thinking about things at a variable level, and shifting from that to a person-centered orientation, where we recognize that, you know, if we're looking at someone's sense of self-efficacy as a variable, they don't experience that sense of self-efficacy independent of all the other variables of which they are comprised. And it's really the cluster or pattern of values across a network of variables that really are more impactful in how we develop. And so shifting to this kind of more person-centered orientation, and extending beyond that, it's you know, and others can correct me if they disagree, but developmental science has used dynamic systems, complex systems levels, types of analysis and concepts as a heuristic for a long time, as a way of thinking about interconnected individuals and their environments. But we've reached a point where there are research tools that we could actually use to move beyond a heuristic and think about system-centered research rather than even just person-centered research. So thinking about the person environment system as a compound variable in the way that you would think of a cluster analysis for attributes of an individual. You could think about a profile or a cluster analysis of an individual in his or her context at a particular moment in time. And there are tools for representing those things through you know, multi-level networks and use of Boolean cubes and concepts of systems, state and phase spaces. And, you know, that's a whole other discussion. But just to highlight that there are ways to think about multiple variables interacting simultaneously as a unit, and conceptualizing it that way and also analyzing it that way. And then one concept that comes out of developmental science that I think is particularly useful for thinking about social justice is this idea of canalization. And I use this quote from Ashley Montague a lot, that you know, the greatest thing about a baby is its promise. The whole world is laid open before a baby, and there's a vast amount of opportunity. And I firmly believe that intrinsically that is the case. But we're born into a social ecological system that has already, in many cases, sectioned off certain developmental pathways. And this is a drawing that Waddington used as his model of canalization, and the rolling ball at the very top is the stand-in for an organism's development. And this landscape is all of the possible developmental outcomes that can occur. But as the marble rolls down this landscape, you know, it first encounters a decision point or a different set of contingencies in the environment that push it one way or the other. And once it heads down that certain path, it can't get back over to the other side. So, you know, if it rolls to my left here, then all of this range over here on the far right in terms of phenotypic outcomes and developmental outcomes, that's cut off now. And that, you know, over time, development becomes tailored that way. And how that's useful is that if you think about a child being born into either a privileged or marginalized group, there's an ecosystem that they've been born into that has canalized their developmental pathways already. One of the most striking statistics that has always kind of haunted me is in my work in early childhood literacy, is that a child who is not prepared to read at kindergarten has about a 10% chance of ever reading at grade level. And if they're not reading at grade level by 4th grade, there's only a 2% chance that they will graduate from college. And that is really striking to me. I've always kind of envisioned this as, this little child walking into a room with little teeny tiny chairs and lots of colored, stuff on the walls, and this bright, exciting room. And they're already behind, and they're already pushed to one side of the developmental pathway that they didn't really have much choice in. It's kind of a striking feature. Sort of modernizing Waddington's original idea, we can also talk about this same concept rather than canalization explicitly, but as different areas of attraction in a developmental system. And for those of you who don't know, this is the Lorenz Attractor. And what these lines represent, this is a graph of a dynamic equation that basically, if it starts anywhere here, if you put the starting position of this dynamic equations, iterative equation, anywhere over in this region, the solution will ultimately converge on this one region of the state space, or the possible outcomes. And it's very hard to get it to leave this space. And so they refer to that as an attractor. The equation converges on a particular solution. If you start it over in this region, it hits another attractor. And once you're in one of these attractor spaces, it's really difficult to get out of it. There's a narrow band of possibility that mathematicians refer to as a separatrix, where, if the stars align just perfectly and you get into this narrow range of possibilities, you can switch back and forth between these two attractors. But that's a very narrow range. So to use this as kind of a heuristic, we could think about the ecology of privilege and the ecology of oppression as attractors, and that development is really canalized into these two systems based on the structure of the ecosystem that an individual is developing in, that was completely dependent upon what neighborhood they were born into, racial or ethnic background, things that they didn't have any choice in and at all. And I think the challenge for developmental systems science is to shift our focus to thinking about how these systems become differentiated, and look for trigger variables, or what gets referred to in dynamic systems literature as control variables, that don't affect just one component. So, like, I love Head Start. I'm a huge fan of Head Start. But Head Start's not nearly as effective as it possibly could be, because everything else in that environmental system is pulling back towards a suppressive attractor that limits how much influence we can have by changing just one variable. But thinking about how the system works as a whole allows us to have a way of looking at it in terms of, well, what kind of variables, or what kind of systems control variables should we be focusing on, whether it's policy, whether it's redistribution of wealth and resources. What kind of changes can we make in those systemic influences that shift the dynamics of the person-environment system from one that has this binary set of attractors to one that has a more equitable base? There's obviously going to be variability, but that the environment is supportive of everyone equally. Now, related to this, those are sort of heuristics and conceptual tools that we can use to think about the way developmental science and social justice intersect. And I promise this is just water. I haven't been in lockdown long enough to start day drinking. But also about the value system that we bring to conducting science. And science, particularly social science, has always kind of had this mantra of being objective and value-free. And that's not entirely true. even, you know, the desire to be objective is a value in some ways, but it is really difficult, if not impossible, to separate out an individual's assumptions and values and way of framing questions from the research process. We make dozens of decisions when we're constructing a research project all the time. And how we make those decisions is really dependent upon the way that we see things. And they can be, you know, everything from the kinds of measures that we pick, the questions that we ask, the way we word those questions, the samples that we look at, the way we frame the concept of the issue. And I can just give one quick example. We use a lot of latent variables in psychology, and these are variables that aren't directly measured, but are indicated by other value or other attributes that we measure. But we define these latent variables based on what we think that they are. And I'll give you a concrete example. I was doing a study looking at child temperament, and there was a number of parenting questions or parent questions about whether the parent, their attitude towards a large family, whether they wanted more kids, their perception of parent-child conflict, their perception of how much of a discipline problem their child was. And I created this latent factor, and in my mind, I was thinking that this is a parental frustration factor. I hadn't labeled it yet, but I was thinking about difficult temperament and children with difficult temperament and interpreting these questions as sort of the parent answering negatively. And it was my parental frustration construct. And I was showing it to a colleague before I had put a label on it. And he said, "This is really fascinating. You've got this parental satisfaction variable, and it's related to these developmental, these temperament profiles." I was like, no, it's parental frustration. And he said, "No, it's clearly parental support and satisfaction." We saw the same thing, but from two different ways because of the way we were thinking about it. And so being very explicit about how our values shape the kind of research process and the intentionality with which we ask questions, I think is really important. And I've got just a few principles that I think are important for looking at developmental science research, and including a social justice agenda. And first is just, you know, where does the origin of your research come from? And this is a picture of, you know, looks like late 19th century, early 20th century gathering of how decisions were made at the time. And you notice very quickly that this is a, you know, paneled room of affluent white men making, you know, decisions about policy and the influences on the world and science. What our decision-making process should be more like is less of this and more of having it embedded in a community context with multiple voices and engaging in more sort of participatory action-oriented kinds of approaches where our research questions and the way that we frame research comes not just from academic journals, but from conversations with diverse communities and the communities of which we're a part. So we should really frame our analyses and our solutions in that context. And we should also stop putting context in the error term. I think a lot of really interesting things happen in the error term of our research. The other principle that I hold on to is being very intentional about what's the point of the research. Is it, and in my view, I think it's important to focus on research that enhances or leads to transformational social change. I'm less concerned with the H index or how many people cited a particular paper. And that's just an intentional value that I bring to the kinds of research that I want to do that focuses it explicitly on social justice. And then also, again, sort of like the community context, really focus on more egalitarian and more inclusive practices in research, and you know, bringing in more diverse individuals, more diverse groups and stakeholders, recognizing that there are multiple stakeholders in any research project, and that, you know, I have this term that I use called professional preciousness, and a lot of times we need to put our professional preciousness, and I'm not Dr. So-and-so from the university and I know all the answers. It's really about, I have one perspective and one voice, and I want to hear from other people's perspectives and other people's voices about how they view a particular issue. And I think, you know, diversifying and flattening research groups is another strong way to do that, so that we don't get kind of caught up in this group think, and we can see research questions from multiple perspectives. And then finally, not finally, penultimately, recognizing that when you're collecting data on human beings, particularly if that data involves marginalized communities, that you have to have an explicit awareness of the social power dynamics that are exerted through the research process, and that are acting on the individuals who are participating in your research, and what impact might those social power dynamics have on the way that people respond to questions, the way that you interpret outcomes, and those sorts of things, and just being more explicit about it. And then finally, particularly if you're doing community-based or intervention-based kinds of work, focusing on solutions that are empowerment-oriented rather than paternalistic is probably the best way to put it. You're doing something with the community, you're doing something with the participants to help empower them, rather than doing something on or for them. And there's a subtle distinction there. And so when I'm looking at different interventions and different prevention programs based on developmental research, one of the questions I always ask is, you know, if this intervention is successful, does it kind of work itself out of its own job, that you're giving people resources and tools to be autonomous and empowered rather than dependent. So very quickly, I know we've got just a few minutes left. I'm just going to quickly go through a simple example of this, not a simple example, but a tentative example. How do we do this? This all sounds very daunting, and where do we start? I always use the quote by Ira Isco, as a community psychologist, who said, you have to begin before the beginning. And you can't really reach out and engage communities in research, particularly if it's social justice oriented, working with marginalized communities. Don't start with the research question. Start with forming a relationship and developing a relationship, and then letting the research emerge from that. And one example of that is some work that I've been doing for nearly 15 years with United Way, and which has culminated in their Bibs to Backpack initiative. But this goes way back. We have two research projects that I'll just kind of glance or quickly go over, that really started in about 2008, 2009. United Way allowed a multi-disciplined group of people from different sectors of community activism. They let us have this little room in their office building, and was dedicated just to this project. And we were really focusing on the issue of third grade MEP scores being really poor in Michigan. And we spent about 18 months, and you can see it was very high tech, very sophisticated, lots of sticky notes and drawing, but really taking a deep dive into the fullness of the ecology and contextual influences and factors that were related to third grade reading in Southeast Michigan. And ultimately that led us to the notion that it had to start way before third grade, and ultimately starting with birth and prenatal development. And this is a part of our war room here where a lot of this later work really came from. Up at the very top, this was a structural equation model that I did using the study of early childcare data, looking at predictors of first grade math and reading scores. Did this study, got positive results, had a number of predictors, thought it was really cool. And that's where I would have published it, and we'd been done, and we'd all been moved on. We solved the problem. I had presented this to the group. We had some handouts in the conference room. It came in a few days later, and some of my colleagues from different disciplines and different ways of thinking about it had literally cut it into strips and put it over all of these different resource and contextual community factors and attributes, and made the case that what we needed was a research-based intervention that would shift with the changing person environment needs. So the first phase of this intervention would really be focused on preparing the family as a whole. The second phase really promoting family health and well-being. And then the third phase focusing on preparing for school. And that led us to our first Social Innovation Fund grant that ran from 2012 to 2017. We had 13 community agencies that we partnered with, really focused on school readiness as our primary outcome, because we thought that that was a real trigger point for systemic level change by improving kindergarten readiness, particularly early childhood literacy. That was really a key to generational change. And we focused on different levels of influence. We had an outcome that we were focused on looking at children ready to learn, that parents and caregivers were prepared and had the resources to nurture their child's development, and that communities had the resources to promote the children's well-being. And we had different indicators of how we measured those different things. And we learned a lot from that, but we decided that that wasn't the full solution. So we went back to the drawing board and applied for another Social Innovation Fund grant that we were awarded in 2016, that we just finished up in August with data collection and sent in the final report in December. Again, another very high-tech process, but we were very intentional about thinking about all of the factors in the community or in the person environment context that influence empowered, autonomously functioning families. And you can see that, we were focused on infrastructure, empowerment was a core component of it, and how do we look at all of the different folks or different aspects of the ecology that we can, that influence this. And then we developed this complex model that was delivered through a family checkup system approach that my colleague, Dr. Chris Trentacosta, was our family checkup specialist for this, and had a wide range of supports that cross all of those ecological boundaries. And then this developed into what we call the GOALS program, looking at serving low-income families with children 0 to 5 in Metro Detroit. And again, it required multiple service agencies covering a wide level of Michigan. The timeline for this one, we did a pilot study starting in October of 2017, started delivering our full programming in February of 2018, and then ended data collection in August. We did the program intervention, but also this was a randomized control trial comparing this family checkup multi-service delivery approach to a standard of care based on whatever services an initiating agency provided. We had a large sample. We had 992 families that participated in this. And it was really diverse. 47% African-American or Black, 24% identified as MENA, 23% as white. We had a lower Latinx and Hispanic population than we would have liked, but pretty good diversity. And basically, we looked at this randomized control trial where we had a comparison group they were all given the same assessments. They were given some very simple feedback about the assessments and the findings, and kind of just traditional services that an agency would have provided, whereas the intervention allowed for a much more comprehensive and personalized set of resources for the family. We looked at a wide range of domains across this program. We assessed them at baseline, 6 months and 12 months. And using that assessment, we would give the intervention group, using the family checkup model, a profile of their relative strengths and weaknesses, and then use motivational interviewing techniques to help them find a solution or a goal that they wanted to really work on, and track those goals, and provided resources to help them achieve that, and supports, and found that we had a pretty substantial impact in a wide array of domains in terms of income, food security, healthcare access, mental health access, life skills, better community involvement, access to health and social services, et cetera. And all of these, we argue, are sort of trigger points for not just improving that one variable, but that by improving that one variable, you change the long-term outcomes of the way that that individual family and their children are able to navigate an environment, even though that environment can be oppressive. And then finally, I think it's really important that we take these kind of scientific-based approaches and translating them into policy and practice, and have that kind of focus. So I just want to acknowledge that particularly the research aspect of this involved a tremendous number of people and a large number of organizations in the Southeast Michigan area, and also to the incredible folks that work in our lab, Lama Ayub, Habiba Adawi, excuse me, Megan Frazo and Haley Hicks. I've just been really lucky and fortunate to have such a great group of folks to work with in this. All right, I'll take any questions. I'll stop sharing.
Yes, so thank you so much. That concludes the presentation portion of this brown bag. Now we move on to the Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, either physically or with the Zoom icon, or you can post any questions in the chat as well. So the floor is open.
Did I see?
Ty?
Yeah.
I really wanted to say that you did something I really greatly appreciated, which is that, there's this famous statement that you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
And Byron Allen, the mega successful entrepreneur, he wrote a similar thing. He said, exposure to a better life can quite often lead to achieving a better life. And your use of the canalization model really sort of makes that visually true, because when you're down in one of those canals, you can't see what's over in the other canals. And if I was still teaching, I think that would be a really great way to get that concept across to students. So I just wanted to say that I appreciated that.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
And a question I have is, when you were being introduced, you were talking about relational factors in developmental science. And I was wondering if you could sort of expound on that a little bit in the context of your project.
Yeah, I think, Bronfenbrenner, gets widely used in terms of, laying out those concentric circles and how that have different layers of influence. What often gets missed is the double-headed arrows in between. And Bill Overton and Rich Lerner, but I think Bill Overton really has done a lot of the intellectual work in the last 5 years or so on focusing on, it's the relationship that counts. Like the variables themselves don't have as much inherent meaning. that the impact or the influence of a particular variable is fully dependent upon its relationship to the other variables, and they don't have any standalone influence, and it sort of comes into the projects that we were looking at in a couple of ways. One is that we had this large collection of variables across different aspects of the family's life, and it's really almost impossible to manipulate or influence one of those independently of the others. So trying to target them as a whole is a real key. And then I think the relational component comes into play when you look at those conceptual models of how that ecology looks different depending on a marginalized point of view, if that makes any sense.
Yes, it does. Yeah.
It's like two children that have the same parents and grew up in the same house, but don't have the same parents and didn't live in the same home because they elicited different things from those parents and had different experiences. And it's the same kind of notion here. And so it's focusing on the arrows, not the values of the variables, if that makes any sense at all.
It makes sense. It's just few people have that kind of unique data set in which they can capture the arrows.
Again, which is why I think it's important when we say that it's important to have that values-oriented intentionality at the beginning.
I'm interested in this raising of the Waddington landscape model, because of course this is something we're all introduced to in developmental psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that one way of refining that model might be to consider the marble as something other than a perfect sphere.
Yes.
To reflect genetic and prenatal factors that would influence development. And then of course, this introduces the idea of the two arrows going in both directions, because of course these genetic and environmental factors are always interacting. So I wonder whether this commitment to Waddington's model might have led to an overemphasis on postnatal environmental factors in development.
I can't speak to the influence, but I wouldn't disagree with that at all. And I think you make an excellent point. One of the big flaws in his model is that the marble and the environment, that surface, are separate, when in fact that's not the case. And, the mother's, the family's history going back generations influences the nutrition during pregnancy, the likelihood of being born prematurely, et cetera. In fact, that study of early childcare model that they split up into pieces, the very far end was low birth weight, preterm birth, maternal poverty, and I'm drawing a blank on the third, but it was exactly these kind of issues where the marble doesn't come out perfectly spherical and is going to be oriented to roll in a particular way. Mm-hmm. So, and I think that comes back to the equity argument as well, where because that marble is not perfectly spherical, it's not about providing an equal environment. It's about providing an environment that compensates for that to provide equitable outcomes. Mm-hmm. That's an excellent point.
All right, I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has any questions. If not, then we can close with Dr. Edwards.
Ty, just one question. If one were to ask, what are the 2 or 3 most important outcomes of your research programs in general, what would you say? What?
Like from this talk or from this kind of approach?
Yes.
I think the first one, most important, is being more explicit about your potential biases and values. In qualitative research, you always see reflexivity statements and kind of self-reflection statements about what influence your own perception might have had in the way you interpreted the data. And I think we need to be much more explicit about that in quantitative research as well, about, why did we choose this measure, and why do we think this question says what we think it says, and does it read the same way in this group versus that group, and being intentional about it. The second thing I think that I would say is kind of to what we've been talking about, how the environment, that ecological model, is not just one uniform model, that it takes on different shades depending on the point of view of the individual in it, and being explicitly aware of that. And so, Lama's work on racializing that Bronfenbrenner model using critical race theory or critical gender theory, I think is really valuable in shaping the kinds of research questions that we ask. And then thirdly, I think being thoughtful at the beginning about the end audience. It's great when I see an article come out in a journal and it's got my name in it, and that's awesome. Or, somebody at a conference says that was a really interesting presentation. That's fantastic. But I get much more reward out of, I have a friend who is a state senator, and she called me once, like on a Thursday, and said, I know you've been doing some stuff with this school-based health center stuff and the mental health outcomes. Is there anything that you can get me? We have a bill that's going to go to vote on Monday. Can you get me something to circulate, to lobby for this, and put together a little infographic about the difference that mental health access with these clinics made in the schools. And, that at least helped in part pass a bill that got an extra $5 million for mental health services in schools. And I think, that's better. I like that outcome better.
That's awesome.
Than my H index going up a little bit. I don't care about index.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Ty, for a wonderful presentation. And people from the social sciences and would be happy to see how almost seamlessly you wove critical race theory into developmental psychology. So the rapprochement between those two areas, I think is very, very helpful. And thank you for participating in the Humanities Center's Brown Bag series. I hope as we're recruiting for next year, several of your colleagues will consider joining up, because I thought I know that the participation of the psychology faculty has enriched this year's programs. So thank you.
Thank you.
Candy,
Walter?
Yes.
I would point out, Walter, there's a couple people in the gallery here who would be excellent speakers for next year.
Put pressure on them now.
Thank you. Thank you. I think sometimes Candy puts the recruiting document in chat, but I don't think she did that today. But
yeah, it's in there.
It's in there. So okay, if you see it there, and then you'll be able to use it to sign up. Yes. Thank you.
And just I just wanted to thank our speakers so much. We're so glad that we were able to give you this platform. Your presentation was well crafted, and I'm happy we were able to capture it. This will be uploaded to our website, so if anyone wants to go back, review anything, or have any questions, feel free to contact our speaker or us. But again, the presentation will be on our website. But again, on behalf of the Humanities Center, we do have a couple gifts for you. We have a journal and a mask with our Humanities Center logo that we hope you wear with pride. And we're so glad to be able to give these to all of our speakers. And like I mentioned before, the talk will be reaching out to you towards the end of the semester to safely get these gifts to you because of COVID. But again, thank you so much. Again, the presentation was well crafted, and we do have applications in the chat if you would like to download or fill it out, because we are currently recruiting. But thank you, and thank you to the psychology department, and thank you to our audience. And if our speaker has any last words, we'll let everyone go.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, that concludes our brown bag for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And we do have 2 more next week, same time, same link. So thank you, everyone, and have a good one.
You too.
Stay safe.